Good morning, year six. Thank you for your engagement with our story this week. So, Within the Jungle Book, we're going to carry on reading that over the next couple of weeks within our English lessons and use it as the prompt for some of our writing. We're also going to try and use some of the skills from it and the knowledge of story from and the plot from Private Peaceful to help us develop as writers. Today, we're going to try and use all of the skills that we've been looking at in our writing over the last week to conclude a piece of dialogue which is about two characters which are disagreeing. So it's about two characters which are disagreeing, and the dialogue gives clues, and the conversation and the action going on within the conversation gives clues about the characters and the motives of those characters. If we look at this, to be successful, we'll consider those characters and their motives of why they're doing things, what might have driven them to think this way. We'll think about how we'll represent these. Before we get into actually writing the passage, we'll think about the characters we're writing about, and then we'll think about how we're going to show those characteristics. We'll plan which language you'll use. So we'll make sure we've got a clear set of vocabulary that we want to use that's ready to use before we try and use it. And then we'll write this engaging piece of dialogue. And as part of that writing process, we'll all make sure that we edit it at the end and double check that we've got all the basics right. So remember that idea of the shoes from last week. We'll clean the rubbish off the shoe and then we'll really polish it up to be as good as it can be. Okay, year six. A bit of recall now. Now, this is partially to do with English, but it's primarily to do with history. And the reason for that is the dialogue that we're going to be writing is going to be set in a historical context. So here we've got true and a false element for our table. And what I'd like you to do to begin your session is to sort some facts into true and false. Now, if you've got these on your page, great, use the page. Or if you just want to have a think about which ones of these are true and which ones of these are false, and then record them, please. Okay, guys, lots of you now identifying which ones are true and false. So our first one, we can see that it's false that World War One was between France and Britain. Both France and Britain were on the same side of the Triple Entente, and therefore they were not combatants. They were combatants, but they were not enemies. They were on the same side. They were allies. The second one, which is false, is the idea that the soldiers lived in the houses during the Battle of the Somme. If you remember from the beginning of our lesson, which we've looked at in history, we've seen how the soldiers within the Battle of the Somme and generally during trench warfare, they lived in the trenches. They lived in the recessed elements of the ground where they could put their heads out and be shot at, but underneath, within the ground, in the hole, they were protected. However, the problem was it was a ditch, and therefore it got all kinds of filth and mud and rats within that ditch. Okay. The battle did last for more than 4 months. So it started, I think, in July and ended in November. So it went on for a long time, that battle in 1916. It's true, and you might not have known this already, but it's true that some of these soldiers will have known people from in regiments. Uh, so sorry, some of the soldiers would have been in regiments with people they already knew. So therefore, that is a true fact. A lot of the regiments, a lot of the groups of soldiers were collectivized or pulled from one village or one town. So, for example, there might be an Erdington battalion where all the soldiers who were going off to battle might be together. I'm not sure why soldiers were like that, whether it was just because it's easier to get them from one place in one go, or if it was an idea that if you knew people already, you might fight better together and might look after each other. Okay. But obviously, there might be complicated elements to that. If me and another soldier knew each other but didn't like each other, it might have made it more complicated when we were in battle. Rather than looking after him, maybe I tried to get him in danger. Maybe I made him stand up above the trench and get shot at by one of these machine guns. Not sure. It could have been a complicating factor. And then huge numbers. So we've looked at the numbers that died. I think it was over 1 million, 1.2 million soldiers died during the battle. So terrible, terrible fatalities. Lots and lots of people dying, and many thousands on that first day of the Battle of the Somme that we've looked at this week in our history. Finally, we've got the idea that the weapons were more advanced than during previous conflicts. During our history lesson, I talked about how it might be it's a complicated word, advanced, for weaponry, because I and I'm sure many of you think that actually making guns that work more efficiently, so kill more people, is a bad thing rather than a good thing. So therefore, using the word like advanced is a complicated word. Advanced normally means that things are getting better if we make advancements. I think actually maybe it was a backward step, allowing us to kill more people. But the truth is that at the advent of the war of World War One in 1914, and certainly by the time 1916 came round and the Battle of the Somme was going on, many people could be killed very quickly by the weapons that had been developed. The grenades, but particularly those machine guns that shot lots and lots of bullets very quickly. Okay, now we've got some sentences here which I'd like you to try and complete using language you've thought about and seen this week. So we've got this sentence: soldiers might have wished to sip upon something, instead stomping sodden through the trenches, instead of stomping, that should say. A combatant, so that's a synonym for soldier. A combatant could have been killed if shot after something their way up the side of a trench into no man's land. And finally, clearly no one would want to be lied to by an officer, particularly if they were viewed as a something of something. Okay, so 3 sentences there, 2 mistakes by Mr. Spring, so Hania will be happy. Within those sentences, can you see if you can identify language we've looked at within our guided reading this week, so within Private Peaceful, language that could go in those sentences, please? Okay, thinking as you go through. Hopefully now you've identified that the soldiers might have wished to sit upon a veranda. If you remember when we were looking at elements of Rudyard Kipling's writing, we had that idea of the veranda being an outdoor space that people could sit, relax, have a nice time on. I'm sure if I were a soldier, I'd much prefer to be sat on a veranda having a cup of tea than stomping and stomping because I'm sodden, so I'm soaking wet through the flooded trenches. I would much prefer to be in my veranda, on my veranda, should I say. Okay, then we're looking at this combatant. You remember that word, that verb that told us how people went up somewhere, they shinned up somewhere. So a combatant could have been killed if shot. So if somebody was shot, it might have been because they'd shinned their way up the side of the trench into no man's land. If you remember, no man's land was the space between the 2 fighting sides. So in this instance, it would be the Germans and the English and the British troops. And that land in the middle would be called no man's land. Because if you went in that land, you would be shot, maybe by both sides, but certainly by the side that you were not from. So if you'd shinned up the side of the trenches and run into no man's land, you could have been shot, could have been killed. Clearly, nobody would want to be lied to by an officer, particularly if this officer was viewed as a man of their word. So remember that phrase which relates to somebody who's honest, a man of their word. It's a useful phrase to use when you're trying to describe a character as honest, but you don't want to just say the honest person, the honest person, the honest person. So it's one of those synonym phrases, synonymous phrases for somebody who's honest, for an honest person. Okay, so we've had a look then at that vocabulary. We can just revisit now the element of direct speech. So we've got the direct speech from earlier in the week. Wow, Ricky Tikki exclaimed as he licked his face. That was amazing. You're welcome, my darling, responded Teddy's mother before falling over, shocked at what had just occurred and screaming. Ah! Scampering quickly away, Ricky Tikki could be heard apologising about the shock he had caused. I'd never wish this to upset you, he said sheepishly, whilst hiding behind it. Okay, so we've looked at that piece of dialogue earlier in the week. Just like to remind you of why some of these elements are in there. We've got the idea of those verbs, those speech verbs. Now they're in there to really show how a character is feeling based on the type of voice they're using. If I'm whispering, it might show that I'm worried about people catching me, or I'm nervous that somebody could swat me. But if I'm shouting, it might show I'm angry. So the different speech verbs show how we're feeling. And we've got the action somebody's doing. Somebody's licking their face. Not very good to do at the current time if you're near other people. But if they're licking their face, it might show they're hungry. It might show they're desperate to eat something. That action verb shows us what they're feeling. Here as well, we've got reaction. Okay, so Eddie's mother doesn't. Her first thing to do isn't to fall over. She does that when she realizes what happened. Her reaction to the talking mongoose is that she falls over. So we've got this reaction that somebody could undertake. Okay. Then we've got this type of word. Lots of us telling me what type of word it is, and the suffix helps us identify that both these ly words are adverbs. but they affect the verb. Scampering is normally quite a quick word anyway, but now I know it's quickly scampering. I know it's really doing it quickly. So that verb of scampering has been affected. And said is the verb which is affected by sheepishly. So I never wish to upset you. Sheepishly shows that somebody might not be very emboldened, not very brave about saying something. Okay, so we've got that adverb which shows how somebody feels. Okay, guys, these 4 elements of this speech are something we need to try and utilize when we plan what we're going to do. So if we think about them, then we're thinking about our character and our motive. As I said earlier, when we were looking at what a successful piece of dialogue would look like, we need to think about a character and their motives. Now, you're going to be writing a conversation between 2 characters from Private Peaceful. That was why our recall element looked at World War One, because you're going to want to set it as this conversation between Charlie and another character, maybe even set it or set an element of it within the trenches. You might think that maybe the other character goes to the trenches as well. Now, we know about Charlie, the older brother of our narrator, Tommy. We know that Charlie is protective, caring. We know he's protective just because of love. He feels love for Tommy. We know he's caring just because that's how he is. He's obviously been brought up by his mother and his father to care for others, and it's how he views people. If you look at his mother, she's a very caring character. Unyielding means he won't give up. He won't just say that's okay. He gets frustrated. He gets fed up by people bossing him around, whether it be a teacher or being unkind to his brother, whether it be another student. He won't cry when he's hit by the teacher as punishment for standing up for his brother. He's defiant as well. He won't just accept that people can get away with telling him what to do sometimes. So again, with the teacher, maybe with the colonel as well. And we maybe see that with his mum and how she reacts when people boss him and his family around as well. The other character I'd like you to think about, and I'll just move myself out of the way of the motives of the colonel, is the colonel. So we know he's haughty. Now, haughty can be a bit of a show off. Okay, he doesn't really consider other people's views very carefully. He basically perceives himself to be the most important person in the room when he walks in. His perspective, his view of himself is that he's really important. He sticks to the rules or sticks to promises he made. If you remember when the Peacefuls are thrown out of the house, that seems weird because we know that he doesn't really like the family. However, he'd made a promise to his dead wife that he would not evict the family. That promise, therefore, is stuck to. So when he makes a promise, he sticks to it. And I think the motive for that is that he doesn't like breaking rules. I think he's very conventional. So I think his motive is that he likes to stick to the rules that he's got. Then finally, he's quite irritable. He gets really annoyed, doesn't he, when somebody poaches on his land or when somebody is making raspberry noises near his horse, like Joe did. So he's irritable. And I think that might just be frustration with the world. It might be frustration with the fact that he's not as important as he thinks he should be. It might be that he's frustrated that he has to mix with people he doesn't want to. So the characteristics, the ones in orange that these characters show, there's a motive, there's a reason for all of them. There's a reason. What you're going to do then today with that character and motive work is you're going to try and write an invented conversation that could take place between Charlie and the Colonel. You can pick different characters from Private Peaceful if you want, but I do want them to be a conversation between characters from a story we've read the first 3 chapters of. And what you're going to think about is which speech verbs you're going to use, which reaction verbs you're going to use, which adverbs you'll use, and finally, which action verb you'll use. So within those elements, you're going to plan a piece of writing, and it might be that you decide you're going to use speech verbs such as muttered and shouted. So if somebody's muttering, are they being powerful, or are they being fed up? If they're shouting, are they being bossy? So have a think about what they're doing. Also have a think about the reaction if somebody's stumbling, how they're feeling, if they're gasping. You might use adverbs like indignantly when people are fed up with people always doing this. Or you might use action verbs like grabbed. But as well as the ones that are there, you may add your own. I suggest you add 3 or 4 in each column. And then you try and use those words in a piece of writing where you write this conversation between the Colonel and Charlie or 2 other characters from Private Peaceful. Include those actions and those reactions.